I don't know how many nationalities there are here, but for those of you who can tell accents, I am Greek myself, now British, I have been British for some time, but with dual nationality. And of course, I've chosen two countries that were the periphery of Europe, if you like, and where for a long time when I was talking about Grexit, and now, of course, we have Brexit. So let's hope that Greece stays in so I can actually travel easily and work elsewhere if necessary. Well, my job has been looking at the UK economy. I used to work for the government and of course, also in the private sector. I worked a lot for the Remain campaign, as one would imagine, and of course was a spokesperson. I think actually they needed more women to go out and tell the story. But of course I was one of the experts, women or men, experts who Michael Gove didn't want to listen to. But nevertheless, I think what the economy has been doing is quite important. And I've just been hearing the end of the previous panel where we're talking about it's all really down to the UK to move politically to make any difference in terms of the outcome. And of course, I mean, this is happening right now, of course, this week in Brussels with the discussions that the UK is having with Barnier and then the summit, see how much they give in. But it is really the political climate that might change, whether it starts affecting people. I think it's quite interesting just looking at the economic data that's coming out and the economic forecasts that are coming out. There is a constant stream of bad news, even though the economy is not doing that badly and we have full employment. But it's extraordinary whether you read a right-wing newspaper or a left-wing newspaper or a middle-of-the-road one. Quite a lot of the economic evidence is beginning to come through about the concerns, the difficulty of actually leaving the EU itself. Whether it's changing people's views yet, it's perhaps too early to tell. I think there is a movement, but of course moods can change very, very drastically. But of course right now what is being sold to the public is that it's the EU that's being difficult. The EU has stuck to its red lines, absolutely right, all sorts of laws that we in the UK helped put together, including how to treat third countries in relation to the financial sector and exports to the rest of the EU. So we'll be bound by all those, whatever we may think will be the case. But it is perhaps going to need to get a lot worse economically before anyone really seriously moves. By the time it will be too late. And actually, I don't really wish negative economic data on the UK, and I don't wish it on my children, who are all either working or looking for jobs. So, and I'm sure this is the case for a number of you here. But I think it is important, nevertheless, to look at how the economic environment might change, what's been happening so far, and what it is actually that experts like myself and others are suggesting about the UK economy in the future. It may be too late to do anything by then, but I thought I'd take you through quickly where we are now. I mean, you probably know quite a lot of this already in terms of what's happening in the world economy. The world economy is growing very substantially, at least by comparison to what it used to do. It is because world trade is picking up everywhere in a synchronized way. For a while, actually, a couple of years ago, we were all very worried because there had been quarters when world trade was falling, which is an extraordinary thing to happen after the financial crisis pickup that took place for the years that followed what had been going on then. But as you see, there are some quarters of actual slowdown, in fact decline, in 2015 in particular, and even 2016. And then it started really picking up. Remember, over that period, we had concerns about sanctions, we had oil price being low, we had commodity prices generally low, we had a recession in Russia, a recession in Brazil, for example, all those BRIC countries really not doing particularly well. Now all that has been overcome, so there's been quite substantial growth from which everyone has benefited. So the UK has done quite well because of manufacturing exports, and so has Europe, which has been growing quite significantly. So what the IMF has forecast now, this is what came out in January, is growth in the world economy of about 3.9%, which actually is rather good. It's higher than it's been for the last few years. It's going back to where we used to be before the financial crisis. And trade, I mean, this is the interesting thing. We talk a lot about this now in relation to what happens with us and the EU in the future, the rest of the EU. I mean, trade it's now been realized how important it is. If world trade doesn't grow, your world economy doesn't grow. And it's quite interesting when you go to events, not just like today's, but I do an event, I speak on economics in something run by the Institute of Ideas, and it's called the Battle of Ideas, happens every year at the Barbican Centre. It happens in the autumn. And I was doing a panel, along with loads of others, on trade. And of course, it's not a sexy subject. This is the sort of thing where people spend their weekends, listening to creative stuff at the Barbican and doing lots of, talking about the world sort of falling apart, environment and so on. We had the largest audience of any group, as far as we're aware, coming to listen to trade. So suddenly it's become a really interesting topic. And I think people are reading quite a lot about it, understanding quite a lot about it, understand the importance of having a proper, good deal with the EU, if that is where we move to, or perhaps, staying where we are, since this is the best deal we've got. Anyway, that's what the forecast is for the world economy. Global economy, 3.9%. Now, the question is, of course, what happens within the various countries? Emerging markets doing fine. The advanced economies can't really grow that much faster than this because, of course, we are mature. And we generally tend to have full employment. It doesn't happen anywhere. But there are concerns about the UK in particular. And the reason for those concerns, in fact, the IMF has put us at the bottom of the league in terms of growth. We have slower growth forecasts for this year than we had forecast for last year, which is the only of the big countries that has that type of forecast. And if you look at this, the UK is the second set of bars that you see there, is what happened to productivity since the financial crisis. We have tended to invest a lot less. We have employed more people, which is quite good news, but we've employed more people in terms of the increase in employment than has been the increase in output, so productivity has suffered quite significantly. So we've had very low productivity growth, and what that does, it is constrains how far you can grow in the future, because you have not invested, you are not innovating, there's a problem about being competitive in the future. And it's one of the reasons why we're likely to be growing quite slowly in the future too. So although we've had record numbers of people in employment, we've actually had a problem of that productivity growth and in terms of where we go from here, because investment has been low. And what has happened is that despite this productivity growth, and the reason why people are beginning to feel it, again, think about how they might change their views, is because we've had inflation due to Brexit, the pound fell very significantly, prices started rising, we suddenly had sort of 3% inflation, when a couple of years ago we had deflation earlier in the odd month. And that, of course, is squeezing real disposable incomes. We've had a few quarters of declines in real disposable incomes and people concentrating buying essentials and not buying other things. And we have the retail sector in real trouble. We hear so many stories of firms being in difficulty or closing down or laying off workers. So that is an area of serious consideration. Then, of course, in terms of people spending, cars, we're very proud of all the output we now have, which is record levels, exporting it everywhere. Actually, registrations are going down. And the worst thing of all is that investment, because of the Brexit uncertainty and also the way the consumer is reacting, in car manufacturing has halved in the UK over the last couple of years. And remember, a lot of the car production is done by foreign firms that have come here and converted our plants into something actually quite productive. And now they are cutting back and wondering what will happen in the future. Of course, you see what's happened to consumer confidence, really slowed down. And that is an issue. I mean, it's been, the consumer tends, if you ask him, to be quite negative. But you see throughout the whole period since the referendum, we've actually had negative figures for the consumer, which, of course, doesn't tell you, any good story about what they might do in the future and also how they're feeling. And if you look at their finances, they are at one of the lowest levels that we have seen in years. And, of course, they're all worried about interest rates. If those increase, partly because of the inflation increase, which has nothing to do with pressures in the economy and all to do with Brexit, they're going to be stuck. I mean, just think, 1 in 4 mortgages in the UK is interest-only mortgage. You raise that rate to 2%, 3%, many people won't be able to afford to pay the interest. And, of course, with house prices slowing down, in London they're falling, then that takes away some of the wealth effect and the equity in those houses. So there is serious concern about this, in addition to the fact that because of low interest rates we've had so far, people have borrowed far too much for basically consumer spending. Now they're cutting back. What will happen, though, to that borrowing which has accumulated over the period if you raise the interest rates? So the long-term trends are pretty miserable, really. And that's another factor coming into consideration. You will all have heard the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who gave a spring assessment, if you like, of where the economy was going, where the finances were going. And with it, you got this very low forecast for growth. We've upped it a bit to 1.5% for this year. But from then on, we have 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. That is at the time when Europe, which is growing at the fastest rate by some counts in 12 years, is going to be having growth of 2.5%. Now, 1.3, 1.4 just isn't particularly good. And anything the Brexiteers were saying in relation to how we were the fastest growing economy has now been proved not to be right. We are the slowest growing economy. At a time of very strong world trade growth, we should be doing really well. Yes, manufacturing is doing fine, but the rest of the economy is not. And even in manufacturing, there are these serious problems, skill shortages and so on. We haven't invested enough to be able to take advantage of this. On that basis, the finances don't look particularly good. We've already borrowed quite a lot of extra money as a nation, which we're all going to have to be paying over a period of time. Having said that, businesses, mainly because of manufacturing, are reasonably confident. So what we are all hoping, those anyway who like to see the economy at least survive in the future and be sustainable, is that investment will pick up as a result. But the uncertainty that we've got doesn't suggest that that's happening. There's a little bit of investment pick up inevitably because there's a limit to how many more people you can hire. And if you have to take advantage of what's happening, you've got to invest. But we tend as a nation to invest a lot less as a percentage of our income than anyone else. And that's a problem which will remain with us in the future. And even though manufacturing has done well, it has not done anything much for our balance of payments. Negative balance of payments remains. In fact, we had a worsening in our balance of trade in the last month. The reason for that is, of course, this is all in value terms. Prices have gone up of manufacturers, of consumer goods, because of the weak pound. We've strengthened against the dollar, but against the euro, we are practically where we were when the pound fell strongly, fell very substantially after the referendum vote result was announced. So we're still finding ourselves quite weak against the euro, which is good for exports, but actually bad for investment and for inflation and bad for our balance of payments. And if you look at net borrowing and what that's done, it's actually increased quite significantly. Yes, we have some slightly better figures that were announced for this year than we thought back in November. But if you compare it with 2 years ago, what we thought before the referendum, there's been a huge deterioration in our borrowing as a result that we need to do every year. The result of this is, of course, that we have a debt-to-GDP ratio of 86%, which we're going to have somehow or other to service. What is true, though, is that because of low interest rates, there's so much money still around, we can borrow quite easily. We're now paying, even though we have 1.8 trillion of debt, which has increased hugely since the financial crisis, we still pay the same amount on interest every year to keep the debt serviced as we did then. So for the moment, it hasn't affected the payments very much. But of course, any increase in yields that may happen in the future, if we already had 2 credit rating downgrades, if there is more, then particularly if we really start growing quite slowly by comparison to everyone else, then yields might in fact change and it might become more expensive to service it. So we worry about that, what will happen to public finances. We worry about what will happen to trade on services. You can see here that the main, if you look at services overall and financial services in particular, the main trading nation for us is Europe, and we worry hugely about passporting, what will happen to all the financial sector jobs that are here, and not just the financial sector ones, but all the indirect jobs too that are linked to this. But just looking at the financial services themselves, they employ about 2 million people in the UK. If you add a few of the services that directly feed into supporting financial services, we have in fact, pockets all across the country. They're not just in London, all across the country. For example, places like Bournemouth, the main sector is the financial sector, which people don't necessarily realise. So it is an issue if, for any reason, that becomes more problematic for us. And then, of course, we worry about all sorts of other things. I mean, people are just beginning to realise what the EU is doing. It isn't just that suddenly the Prime Minister is saying, yes, we want to stay members of all these agencies. And, of course, the Europeans have said, you must be joking. You're not EU, you can't. But, of course, there's a lot of money that comes into the exchequer. And goes specifically actually also into regions and has helped hugely regenerate all sorts of parts of the UK. So although, yes, we do pay a certain amount into the EU, we get loads of it back, as you all know. Even the CAP has been actually helpful for loads of regions which strangely voted for Brexit, as we know. And now, of course, they're all saying we quite like that money still. I mean, you see how significant it actually is. So it's the European Social Fund, the Regional Development Fund, the Agricultural Guarantee Fund, etc., etc. There's investment aid directly, which is distributed between the various bits here. There's co-financing that comes in. There are loans and bank guarantees. The European Investment Bank has been very heavily involved in rebuilding various schools and also the whole new training facility in Oxford was built actually with EIB loans. The CAP payments are quite significant. Of course, we already heard from Michael Gove, who is our Minister in charge of Agriculture, that actually we're still going to be paying those to the farmers. So basically, we're not saving very much at all. Then there's all the other types of technical aid that we get. The R&D credit, the R&D help, and particularly Horizon 2020, is hugely important. As a nation, we get more back from Europe than we put in this area. And of course, we'd like to continue. There are already hints that we're going to carry on with that even afterwards, because in this particular area, you can actually have non-EU members that are there. Now, it's just begun to be realized that this actually will mean quite a lot of problems for particular regions and sectors, and how to make up for it. So this idea that we're going to be saving any money is just not going to materialise from leaving the EU. In addition, of course, to the divorce settlement and to continuing to pay pensions and so on for a long period of time that we've already agreed to. Then, of course, is migration, the thing, of course, that you all want to talk about and are concerned about, where you can see that London in particular relies a lot on EU labour, but you can see across the UK in all sorts of areas. And this is a type of work that people do. If you also look, of course, at construction, for example, or the hospitality trade, we find that EU workers are very prevalent. And it was quite interesting because there was some announcement from Travelodge this morning, those of you who are listening to the Today programme. They are saying that a third of all the people who work in their company are EU nationals. And of course, they're trying to train more UK people, but they do suggest that there's going to be huge shortages in that sector over the next few years, which are not going to be filled very easily, and there is an issue for the industry ahead. But that, of course, is the case for loads of sectors. And of course, we know that migration is slowing down. In fact, by comparison to previous years, is down very significantly. From the EU, and that, of course, reflects people's concerns about the future here. Of course, we know during the transition period, everyone who's here should be fine, but there are still issues about whether they have the same rights as those who will be here in this country on the 29th of March. The EU, of course, wants the same types of arrangements to be made for anyone else who comes in through the transition period. The UK isn't quite happy with that. That will all be discussed this week. It suggests, I mean, from my perspective, I think the UK so far has given in to almost everything because we have very few cards. We sell 45% of our goods and services to the EU. They only sell 7% to us. So where are the cards at all that we have? So hopefully there'll be more clarification on people, and therefore we might see this migration thing change. You know the data. Nurses' interest to come here from Europe has collapsed. It's fallen by 94% in the last year. And of course, these are areas where we do need them particularly. Then, of course, is students. International students contribute here hugely. A lot of of income. This is an export, and it also affects regions. It's not just London, but you can see here the contribution. This is the net economic impact. You can see that in the blue round little circle that I have there. The EU students are very significant. You can see that from the EU, which is the orange bar. That's there. So you see it is actually quite significant. Of course, there are loads of Chinese students coming and others, but the proximity with the EU, of course, has been a very helpful factor for us. And then, of course, finally, in terms of the issues, there's a lot of discussion about how migration or restricting migration might increase real wages for people. We blame the migrants for the low wages. We also blame them, and we say actually we want to keep the skilled people here, not the unskilled ones. The reality is that most people who come in are skilled anyway, and there are quite a lot of skilled people working in lower skill areas, raising productivity. And the OBR has calculated that without the number of migrants we had before, we'll have less growth, we'll have less a larger debt to GDP ratio and a larger deficit. And why is that? It's because migrants generally, whatever people say, contribute more to the exchequer than take out, and they are the only members of the community in the UK who contribute positively to the exchequer. The rest of us, that's why we have a deficit, take it all back. So here we have all these people who come in, already educated, born somewhere else, so National Health Service somewhere else has taken care of them. The education system was paid by someone else, somewhere else, and we just take the output of it without having had to put any money into it. And it's an extraordinary situation. And of course, because of that, they don't actually use the services, anything like the rest of us does. But the interesting thing is that even this myth of reducing wages is not correct. And of course, if we do indeed have this reduction in migration of the type that Theresa May has talked about, which is in tens of thousands, rather than 200,000 a year, which we absolutely need, at least, then the rest of the economy suffers. And the forecasts are that, in fact, both productivity will suffer and wages will suffer. This is from the National Institute, and it agrees, in fact, with what most economists would say. So, we do, of course, face challenges with our Brexit. Brexit is important, but there are loads of other things. Serious concerns about skills, productivity, all that sort of stuff that I mentioned. We haven't built enough houses. That's why lots of people were complaining about the immigrants. It was just that. We haven't paid a lot for infrastructure. None of these things will be solved if we are a poorer nation that can't actually distribute the money in any sensible way to achieve all those objectives. So that's a real issue. And of course, London in particular, if you look at this last sentence there, will be affected if there is a no deal. And that's the sort of forecast that's coming out from whether it's the Whitehall report that was produced, whether it's the Centre for Cities report, which actually demonstrates this. So to sum up and looking ahead, I spoke at the beginning about the impact on people's living standards and GDP and how will they feel it. Brexiters say, look, we're growing, so what's the deal? I mean, the first thing to remind everyone is that we haven't left yet, obviously. The second thing to remind everyone is that we haven't invested enough because people have uncertainty. The third thing is that the consumer is under strain because of Brexit. And the fourth thing is that because of this slower growth, we've already lost GDP that we would have had. So the Bank of England has already estimated that by the end of this year we will be 2% less well off than we would have been otherwise. In other words, national income will be 2% less than it would otherwise have been. That's about £40 billion. Which you can see, you can distribute that to the National Health Service, teachers, care people, all that sort of stuff, which we haven't done. In addition, of course, we've done something else. In order to keep the economy going, the Bank of England has put huge amounts of money into the economy. Liquidity was increased, we had quantitative easing, lower interest rates, and of course subsidised lending to firms and households through the banking system but underwritten by the government, which has increased our debt by another 100 billion. In addition, we had to pay DUP an extra 1.5. We've already allocated an extra 3 billion for the civil service to work on, and that's, we're just talking about people who work with the Brexit label. There's everyone else who's involved in this. So the costs have already been very significant, plus we've pledged that we're going to continue to support farmers and regions, and we're going to continue to pay into the budget for the EU in terms of Horizon, whatever comes after Horizon 2020. So there is an issue. This putting it all together as costs has not been done properly, has not been explained to the population. So far, let alone what's going to come in the future. So right now, of course, getting the right transition is important to give that certainty to the economy. Everyone, of course, will be worried about any indication for the future. Are we going to have a customs union? Everyone, of course, also is concerned about the political uncertainty. Will this government fall? Are we going to have a different one? Will there be one that is more pro-Europe? Who knows exactly where the Labour Party actually stands? And this is not a political statement. This is what they say they said this morning on the radio, for example. And then the idea that we'll have sector deals and that therefore we don't need to worry because the car industry and so on will be doing fine. The truth is that I think we're going to get tariff-free trade. No doubt about that. No special sector deals will be forthcoming because there will be no cherry picking. But so no tariffs, but if we're out of the customs union, we have this serious problem. The costs have only just begun to be calculated. Individual banks already are telling you themselves, which is not, of course, affected by the customs union, but they will be affected by passporting, what it's cost them already to plan for the future and the capital they will need to have in different countries if they have to set up separately. But also the customs union costs, the CBI has calculated them, has actually gone very strongly in favour of staying in the customs union. That would be actually very important for the economy here. And then, the financial sector too, and whether equivalence would be a good thing or not for us. But what it has done, however we end up in terms of the discussions this week, and of course the summit that's happening on Thursday and Friday, to agree that and move on to the next phase of negotiations, the question will still be, have we anticipated the difficulty? Has the population understood it? Are the things that I've just been showing you going to be sufficient to make people think again? And will Parliament realise that actually, if they want to have a sustainable growth in the future and individuals get re-elected, we need a vibrant economy? And I think that is what will eventually determine where we end up. And the worry about, of course, all experts is that, like during the referendum debate, we will again be ignored, and by then it will be too late to do anything about it. So I'll stop here and perhaps opening up to a couple of questions if we have any time. Perhaps we don't. No time, no questions. Sorry about that. That's it. So thank you very much.